Okay, welcome everybody to our wonderful webinar today. And I'd like to introduce my friend J.D. Schramm. And
oh, Marilyn, you're muted.
There you go. Welcome everybody. I'd like to welcome my friend J.D. Schramm for our speaker today. And J.D. is a communications coach, keynote speaker, and trainer in private practice in Marin County. He serves on the faculty of the USC Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism, and is the author of Communicate with Mastery, Speak with Conviction, and Write for Impact. His 2011 TED Talk, Break for the Silence, for suicide attempt survivors, has been viewed over 2 million times and translated into more than 40 languages. He has dual citizenship, at both a member of Most Holy Redeemer Catholic Church and as well as Unity Church of San Francisco. What happens if you have high aspirations of how you can change the world, but your message fails to inspire people to act? Well, then nothing happens. Using my gifts as a leadership communication coach, my experience as a professor, and my talent as a professional speaker, it helps people translate their aspirations into a story that inspires action. So with that, I would like to introduce JD for our talk this morning.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Pam and Sister Marilyn, for the welcome, the introduction, the promotion, and the opportunity to have this conversation with all of you. I respect the work that you do as liturgical consultants and advisors, and read through like just the variety of backgrounds for people who go into this profession, be it a vocation or an avocation or a primary source of income. And the question I want us to wrestle with, and that I will provide some insights or frameworks to, is how can we best communicate about change before, during, and after the change happens? Particularly, specifically in faith communities where everybody has an opinion, many of them differ with one another, everyone has a sense of ownership, and they can walk away at any point in time. It's a very different relationship that people have to their faith communities, their church that they attend, than they might have to their employer. And so that's the question that I'm going to offer some insights for, a case study as an example, and I want to have rich conversation. So I do have some slides which I'm happy to share after the fact with anybody. I didn't send them out in advance because they were finished about 4 seconds ago, but I'm happy to share the slides and the resources after the fact. But let me just get into it a little bit here and show you what I have in mind. So just give me a thumb up. Are you seeing Illuminating the Path for Change? Excellent. So I've been, as Marilyn mentioned, I've been doing this for a long time, a little over 25 years of teaching communication in higher ed at NYU, Stanford, Columbia, now USC, and doing consulting and coaching on the side. When I first started teaching change management or communicating change, this is the model that I learned and that I started with. Now, across the x-axis, you see time. Across the y-axis, you see level of importance. And this is the bridges model of change. Show of hands, anybody seen this before? It's from the 70s. It's been out there for a long time. And the sense is when you first announce a change, everybody is really attached to the way things are. That's the bottom darker blue, the ending, the losing, the letting go. What do you mean they're going to replace the payphone with a cell phone station? Like everybody, we use that, and the over time, what we're letting go of, what is from the past, gets less and less and less, There's that messy middle where we're in that whole, I don't know what's going to happen here, and that neutral zone. But there's just that little bit of the new beginning, and then as the change comes into play, the new beginning becomes that's which is most important to us, and what we're letting go of is still a part of it. I think of that very furthest part on the right-hand side. I go back to my hometown where I grew up in Hays, Kansas, and people will still talk about, oh, the Murphy's house on 20th Street. It's like, yeah, they sold that in the 1980s, but it's still called the Murphy's house. So there's a little bit of the way things used to be. So that's the model I taught for a really, really long period of time until I learned this model, which is what I'm going to spend time with you today on. Illuminate is a book written by Nancy Duarte and Patti Sanchez. The full title is Illuminate, Ignite Change Through Speeches, Stories, Ceremonies, and Symbols. And when I read this book, I think it came out in 2015. When I read this book, the light went off for me. I was like, oh my gosh, this is such a better way to look at how to communicate change and guide people through change in an organization. So what I'm going to do in about 3 or 4 slides, I'm going to teach you the basics of the model. I put my email address in my name, and I'll also drop it in the chat in a little bit here. I'm happy to send the slides to anyone who asks. And I've also got a 8-slide executive summary of their book that I can send to you for free. I think buying the book is a good idea, but I'm happy to send that out to anybody who emails me. But let me just give you the quick summary of what the Illuminate model is, and then I'll show this as a case study for a 104-year-old congregation, Unity San Francisco, and how they applied this model in their move from an old building to a new building, and then open to a lot of discussion. So their model of innovation over time is based on the S-curve. And those of you who've been to business school or have interacted with MBA students or business professors may be familiar with the S-curve. That is, when you're going to start an innovation, you start out, you've got a sense of something that you're going to do that's different than the way it's been done in the past. And then you begin to grow, you climb up that line, you get to a point where that innovation or initiative or product is mature, starting to go into decline. And right at that moment, there's a new dream, a redream, where you then begin to think about another innovation, another invention. And this series of S-curves is the way innovation happens. For example, you can look at a product, a faith community, a political action community goes through a series of these S-curves as the entity matures or grows. Best way, I think, to look at this is just think of what's happened for us with how we listen to music. Used to be we all listen, and I love that I'm talking to a group of people that are from my generation. We all remember vinyl albums, and that's how you listen to music.
Well, I have this webinar.
And then the vinyl album gave way to the 8-track. Now, when the 8-track started, it was not as good as the vinyl album. Some would argue it never got as good as the vinyl album, but the 8-track was the innovation, and then it got replaced by the cassette, and then it got replaced by the CD, and then it got replaced by streaming music. I think the next thing is we'll get a chip that we can actually implant in our head so we can listen to our music. But it's this sense of innovation is always something that's different than what we had before. It's usually not as good at the beginning, but then it gets better. And that's the climb of the S-curve. So what Patti and Nancy did is they took that S-curve and said, okay, how does that guide us in terms of change in an organization? And they realized that there were really 5 or maybe 6 phases that an organization goes through from beginning, middle, and end, and that it follows this S-curve. So this one slide, we're going to spend a lot of time on. I'll take it off and put it back on in a moment. But for something to be different, there has to be a leader. And notice the torch that she has in her hand. They call leaders who drive change torch bearers, because their job is to shine light on a new pathway, a new possibility. What if we redesigned this liturgical space? What if we let go of this space and built a new space? But it's that leader who takes the risk, and then that community that then takes that leap and says, okay, let's check it out. Okay, let's try. Now, once that leap is made into an innovative or a different way to do things, then there is this, and it could be much longer than is illustrated here, this fight and this climb stage. And when I've taught this model in class to my students at Stanford, they really saw that it's fight, climb, fight, climb, fight, climb. Like you may go through multiple of those, but ultimately you get to the top of that S-curve and you arrive. The project is done, the bishop is there, the ribbon is cut, the church is opened. But then notice that that little S-curve starts to bend down, and there is another redream that happens. Now, that may be in faith communities 20 years later. In the world of iPhones, that may be 10 seconds later, okay? But it's the whole idea that once we arrive, we're not done, because there's going to be a different need, a different community, a different initiative that's going to draw us forward. Now, perfect. We're right at 10:15 here on the West Coast. Before I go into the case study, questions, reactions, clarifications, anything I can say about the model before I apply it to a church community. And somehow I have raised my own hand. I actually don't have a question, but I've raised my own hand. I need to put my hand down.
JD, I have a question.
Yes, please.
When they're in the fight stage, isn't it true that it's a choice phase where you can choose either to go on or to go backwards? I mean, isn't that a critical point?
Yes.
And what do you need to go forward to the climb? Because sometimes they don't want to go there.
Yeah. And I'm actually gonna, I should have done this in advance. I'm gonna pull my copy of her book to show you a part of the book that I think is really useful. It also lets me demonstrate that's not a fake background. It really is my bookshelf, really is a ladder that rolls back and forth. I think that there are, if you are committed to the long-range vision, you do need to guide the community through this messy middle, this fight stage, but to be able to persevere and ultimately get to where you want to go. What Duarte and Sanchez offer is that at times you need to do that with an encouraging tone, and at times you need to do that with a warning tone. Now, that may not come from you all as consultants. That may come from the chairman of the board of trustees. That may come from the senior minister or from the pastor or from the building committee chairperson. But it may be that you have to encourage people through that fight phase by saying, yeah, but think what's possible if we have enough parking for everybody on Sunday. Think what's possible if you know, everybody has a seat at Christmas and at Easter, or the warning phase of, if we don't make this shift, people are going to go to another church. People are going to be drawn to the mega church or the newer building or the building that has children's programming because they want that. So you may use an encouraging tone, reminding them of the vision, or a warning tone, reminding them of what happens if we don't do it. Much like we saw here, that if we don't make changes, we're going to, decline and go into death, metaphorically, or we've seen a number of faith communities that have died and their buildings have become condos and restaurants and other things other than what they were designed to be. Now, the reason I wanted to pull the book out, if you do get the book, she has this lovely centerfold that folds out of the book, where in each of the stages, she gives an exact example of a motivating speech or a warning speech. So at the fight stage, she says, you may need a battle speech. Stir courage by describing the enemy's damage, what is, and warn of the potential continued harm. Expose the opponent's weakness and articulate how to win. Now, it's not usually how we talk about faith communities, but thinking of what's possible, what's going to happen if we don't. Or if you need more of a motivating speech, acknowledge people's suffering and ask them to master the strength they need to pull from behind, to be the underdog, to be able to accomplish what's there. So I think it takes a different level of communication to get people past that fight stage. Other questions about the model? I keep looking at Father Gilbert. It looks like your hand is up to ask a question, but I think that's just your photo. So I'm gonna let that go. Okay, so let me give you the case study. I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson here about Unity of San Francisco, and then show you what they did. And I'm going to come back to this S-curve as I describe what they did. The tools that Duarte and Sanchez offer, there's 4 tools: speeches, stories, ceremonies, and symbols. Oh my gosh, in churches, we are really good with the ceremonies and symbols. And so I'm going to give you some examples there of ceremonies and symbols they did to make this change easier for people. But let me tell you about Unity of San Francisco. This is the church building that they were in for about 20 years. This was their 9th home. Unity of San Francisco was founded in 1919, and they were, at the point in time our story begins, they were a 99-year-old church community in a denomination that at that point was only 130 years old. So not the millennia that some of our faith communities can trace their history to, but Unity was founded in the late 1800s by the Fillmores, a couple in Kansas City, Missouri, and Unity of San Francisco was one of the first congregations outside of Kansas City, so almost as old as the denomination itself. The building that you see there in San Francisco, if those of you are familiar with San Francisco, this is about a block from St. Dominic's Catholic Church in the Fillmore district. It was a Victorian storefront. It was a 3-story building. On the top floor, there were in the front offices that they rented out to therapists, and in the back of the second floor was the church office. The main floor that you see there below the banner was the sanctuary, which is pictured there on the right-hand side. And then in the basement, they had a fellowship hall and a space for, kind of a space for children. They had been in this community for 20 years. They'd been in this physical location for 20 years. They owned the building almost outright. They had a nominal mortgage, but it was tiny compared to the value of the real estate. And there's a lot of distinctions to Unity San Francisco. The one I like to share is this is the community that Maya Angelou was a part of in the 1950s and 60s. And they have a lovely clip on their website of an interview that Oprah Winfrey did with Maya Angelou about her own spiritual development, where she calls out Unity of San Francisco as being an important an important part of her development in her life. And so let me just double check that I've got the right slide next here. Yeah, okay. So let me walk you through the Unity San Francisco story based on this model. So the dream stage, their new minister, Reverend Kindagel, was installed 8 years ago, so 2015. And I did an interview with him the other day, and I was like, when did you know that the space that you all were in, this space on the right here, when did you know that that space didn't serve you? And he said, in the job interview, it was clear to me this was not the space we needed to be in. As you can see, it's dark, it's got pillars. It was limited. There was no way they could grow. There was the office was cramped. The basement was damp. So he began to shine the light on the possibility of a different space. But he also knew that the faith community had been in this space on Bush Street for 20 years. And although it was their 9th home in San Francisco, nobody who was a part of the community remembered their 8th home. So it's the only place that people knew as a home for Unity of San Francisco. And so he began to dream of the possibility of a new space. And he had conversations with his board, as well as, and the board did agree at one point to at least put a committee of members together to determine if what was the most conducive space to their community. And they were not called a search committee. They were just inquire into this question. They had a diverse group of people who looked at it, and Reverend Daigle told them, if you come back and tell us we are in the best space possible, let's keep that. That's what we need to do. They went and did their work, and I think he said they spent 3 or 4 months doing this investigation, and they came back and said they needed a different space because, and I believe there were 4 reasons. There was no physical room for growth. The inside architecture was not able to be shaped in any other sort of way. There was not enough natural light, and they were too far from mass transit, from BART or Muni, and a number of people were now coming to the community from the East Bay and from Marin. They needed to be sure, or the South Bay, they needed to be sure they had mass transit. And the board looked at what the committee came back with and said, even if we could afford to take care of the first 3, there's no way to take care of number 4. Like they physically can't move this building closer to a BART station. And so then they took the leap and they said, okay, let's now look at what we need to do to explore a different space. Well, one of the first things they had to do was appraise their current building and find out what the market would allow. Oh my gosh, putting your church on the market is a terrifying thing. Reverend Daigle said, we were not going to put a for sale sign on the outside of the building. That just, it's like, if you see a restaurant that has help wanted, you're like, especially if it says cook wanted, I'm not going to go there to eat. When you see a church that says, building for sale, it's like, well, that's not going to be our permanent community. And so they quietly put their building on the market and allowed the committee to begin to look at possible other buildings. Reverend Daigle said, we had to grow in our consciousness to be ready for a more spacious environment. People were used to the size of the community, the familiarity of the space, the familiarity of the community. But they took the leap, and then they began the fight stage, searching for a building. They had a number of near misses. So they knew that they wanted wide open spaces and, if any way possible, natural light. And so they looked at grocery stores, auto repair shops. They looked at a lot of auto repair shops that have wide open space, and many of them have skylights in them. They were very close on a janitorial supply company that actually became an art gallery. They did walk into a church building at 240 Page Street. And Ken says they walked into it, looked around, said, this place is going to take way too much work, and walked back out. But a couple of interesting things happened as we moved to that climb stage. First of all, in California, cannabis became legal. And the city of San Francisco said, okay, if cannabis is legal, we're going to determine where cannabis locations can go so far away from schools, so far away from residential. Like there was a rule for where cannabis dispensaries could open geographically. Well, it ended up the block that they were on Bush Street was a designated block that would be eligible for a cannabis concern to go in. They got a bid on their current building at $4 million. They got a bid on $4 million. Then City of San Francisco did their zoning, here's where you can put cannabis concerns. And this venture capital firm increased their bid to $5 million. Another cannabis concern came in at 5.5, then it went up to 6. And ultimately, they were able to get $6 million for their current space with a 1-year search that they could look for a new community, new space for them to live in. And if at the end of 1 year they hadn't found a new space, they could void the contract at no loss. And they got the right to rent the building back for 6 months after they found their new space at no cost. Now, when Reverend Daigle told their real estate agent, this is what the deal he wanted, the agent said, you're not going to get that. Went back to the VC firm and they said, yes, we will do that. So very quickly, they were in contract to sell their current building. They hadn't yet found a new building. They'd looked at a ton of stuff, and they were one day looking at a building on Octavia Street that was new construction, and it wasn't right for them. It wasn't going to work for them at all. But a number of the people on the search committee said, what about that church across the street with the for sale sign on it? And Ken said, we looked at that. It took too much work. And the realtor said, they just dropped the price another $500,000. Maybe you should look again. So they went back and looked again. And now they had the experience of looking at all of these places that they'd have to renovate and put in elevators and do all this sort of stuff. And they said, you know what? This might work for us. And so they put in an offer to buy 240 Page Street, which is the yellow church that you see there, and you see the interior of it. And they went into contract to buy this church for $2.78 million, so just under $3 million. They were already in contract to sell their existing space, which was smaller and not appropriate for them, with a $3 million profit. And they had all of these deals ready. They presented it to, in their faith, this big of a deal. The board can't decide, the minister can't decide, the community has to vote. They did the community vote, and it was unanimous. Now, I don't know how much you know about the faith communities you interact with. There had not been unanimous decisions on something this weighty. And so that was huge for them to be at that point. And so then they moved to the arrive phase, that end place, and they had the new space, and they were just about at their centennial. So this is May of 2019. Their centennial was July of 2019. And without a lot of fanfare, they painted the church, they cleaned the church, they moved a lot of the stuff that had been left by the former congregation. On the day of their centennial, everybody showed up at the Bush Street location, and it was packed. There was like 150 people in the room that easily seated maybe 80 to 100. Like, people were shoulder to shoulder. There's folding chairs. And Reverend Daigle and his associate minister, Reverend Morency, came out, and they said, "Oh my gosh, this is too packed. This is tiny." And they loaded everybody on buses. They had 3 tour buses waiting outside that pulled up right after service began. And they drove to the new location, and they had their first service on the day of their centennial in the new space at Unity of San Francisco. Now, a couple of things about the space they bought. This building, built in 1909, right after the earthquake, was built to be a German Methodist church and actually held services in German until 1948 in that space. Different faith communities had owned it. In the 1970s, it was bought by a Baptist temple, which is how you see it decorated there. And the Baptist temple had owned it for about 40 years and had pulled one permit for renovations, and that was to put this electric sign out front. And that was it. That was the only change that they had made. So they took on a building that had a lot of deferred maintenance that was needed. There were large stained glass windows, like you see the one at the left of Jesus at Gethsemane, that were dark and broken. The fellowship hall that you see downstairs, and it had this huge pipe organ in it that still had German on the keyboard, which was fascinating. And that's the space that they moved into. And perfect timing. Let me tell you what they did with it, and then we'll go to the discussion. So what they chose to do was first to paint. They painted the outside, they painted the inside, they lightened it up massively. You can see they chose to remove the pipe organ, which may be a sensitive subject with this group, but they repurposed it to an outdoor music festival in Ohio that they gave the organ away for free if they came and removed it. And they were able to relocate that there. They took all of the white church pews, again, gave them away. A family was preparing for a wedding for their daughter in their upstate in Sacramento, and they gave the pews away as long as the people came and took them. And that family apparently then started a church pew rental business for other families who were looking for, a way to do outdoor weddings. And they brought their chairs from their existing location because it was important to them to have flexible seating. There's a little bit of a rake that's there, but not much. And then with the stained glass windows, they kept the exterior of the stained glass windows, but replaced the interior of them with a more neutral, as you see there, the green and yellow diamonds, not keeping the crucifixion, the Jesus at Gethsemane, the Good Shepherd. Unity is a Christian faith, but that is not a part of their theology. And so they wanted to have something that was neutral, both that fit their space, that was lighter, but that also would make it more neutral if they rent the space out for dance recitals or weddings or memorial services, which they'd begun to do a lot of. They had also invested a lot in technology that they brought with them and expanded once they got to the new space. And they had a very strong live stream technology, which was remarkable because they moved in July of 2019. And as we all know, by March of 2020, everything was remote. But they had built the live stream capacity such that they were able to do services for the period of time that we were in COVID. And their community actually grew because they now had people all over the country that were attending their live stream services. They launched a capital campaign, wasn't actually needed. Remember, they had that $3 million, but they launched a $300,000 capital campaign. They got the windows sponsored. They got the chandelier sponsored. They got the doors sponsored. Some of the live stream technology sponsored. And they closed out the capital campaign in less than 3 years. And they did the campaign both because there were things that they needed and because they wanted people to have a sense of ownership of the new space. They renovated, they did all the renovations they could without permits. So they haven't dealt yet with the lift. They haven't dealt with the rake in the floor, the earthquake retrofitting. They've got all those plans approved through the city, but they did all the work that they could do without permits, the painting, the cleaning, the restoring of the kitchen, building a children's room, restoring, moving the pastor's office. They did everything they could, and now they're ready. They've got the money in the bank. They can do the rest of the renovations and bring it up to code, but they've not yet done that. So they are right at that redream stage where it's like, okay, we're in, we've made this space work for us. Now, what do we need to do next? All right, let me stop there. That's the Duarte Sanchez model. That's the case study of Unity San Francisco. What questions do you have or comments do you have? And I'll pull slides back up if I need them, but let's just have a conversation.
Does anyone have any questions? Raise your
Gilbert,
hand.
go ahead.
The question I have is, how did the congregation find kind of its goals and aspirations for the new space? So they understood the limitations of their old ones, but how did they begin to dream in new ways when they didn't have a building yet? So to give them an idea of what they needed to look for.
Yeah, Reverend Daigle said that they did a visioning exercise with the board around, okay, we've decided we're too far away from mass transit. What do we want? What do we expect the new space to be? And he said that everybody had slightly different images, but kind of when they collected they did a meditation exercise that was facilitated, and they came back out of that meditation and that reflection, and there were certain elements that were very true to them. People said light and color, and there was also a sense of people on the sidewalk trying to get in. So a sense of being a center of activity, a draw for it, and that it be filled with light and color, which gave them a lot of freedom to look at everything, but they kept coming back to that sense of light and color and draw, engagement for people. And when they did the opening on the day of the centennial, and my friend John Kerrigan is on the call here, who's a deacon at the Catholic community at Stanford. He and his family were there at the day that we did the centennial, but there were people standing on the sidewalk waiting to get in because they were doing the opening, and there was, even without the new stained glass windows, there was a sense of light and color with the painting the interior white, painting the exterior white, that made it the draw that they were looking for. And so they just kept going back to that image and looking for things that would support that image. Gilbert.
Thank you. And the second part of the question is, you talked about the motivational speech and then the fear speech, right?
Yeah.
Did they ever have to go to that fear speech?
They did not. And the other choice that Reverend Daigle made early on, like, he knew he wanted a different space, and he knew he couldn't be the driver of this. He could shine the light on it, but he actually had a board member, Robert, who was the one who was the voice of the board and the decisions that were being made. And whenever they had town hall meetings, Robert was the one who updated people rather than Reverend Daigle. And even when they had that very important vote, are we going to sell at this price? Are we going to buy at this price? The realtor came in and explained the offers that were out there. fielded all of the questions. So Reverend Daigle wanted to see this happen, but knew that he couldn't be the one who voiced it. And so other people voiced it, and he abstained from the vote because he wanted it to be a vote of the community.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes, Sarah. Hi.
So I'm part of a religious community whose building hasn't been renovated since the 80s, probably. And everybody sort of knows that it needs to be renovated. But I think the dauntingness of paying for it feels insurmountable. So I don't know that the community has even gathered to say, hey, maybe we should renovate it, because the idea of paying for it. And I think this is probably something that happens to a lot of churches. And yet, if the church doesn't improve, it's going to get smaller. And the pandemic has already, caused a lot of churches to shrink and some to close. So how would you, in that sort of rallying speech, encourage churches to either step out in faith, or how do you address that? How do we fund this?
Yeah, they were blessed with the
Yes.
real estate without a mortgage, and the whole cannabis thing that was remarkable. But they also knew that they could not accept a $4 million offer, or even a $4.5 million offer. Like let's stay in our own space. If we can't get it, let's put it on the market later. Let's do something different. And so they did have prudent limits on what they could do. And they were bold in their aspirations. And I love the realtor who said, yeah, you're not going to get that. Okay, you got that. And so being able to articulate that. For other communities that are not in that particular situation, I think you've got to have, you've kind of got to have two levels of conversations. You've got to have that sense of aspiration. What is it that we want to make possible? What is it that we dream of? That's where I think aspirational language and sketches or images or vision boards that let people dream of what's possible there. And you've also got to be realistic around the resources that you do have. And okay, for us to meet this aspiration, we're going to need a capital campaign at this level, or we're going to need, grant writing that will fill in at this level. And so it's being able to not let the realism become pessimism, and not let the aspirations become unfounded optimism, but something you can step into.
Is this the sort of conversation that you facilitate, or would a congregation look to a liturgical consultant? Though again, my particular congregation, I can't imagine them saying, "Yeah, let's pay for this other thing."
Yeah,
which is a hard conversation.
It is. So my role was, and I'm a part of the community, but they asked me to come in May of 2019. So they had made the decision to do the buy and the sell, but now it's actually doing that move and letting go of the church that they've had for 20 years and stepping into this new space where they knew they were going to find, unkept maintenance and expenses were going to be more. And so that's when I taught them the S-curve model, and I showed them where they're at, what they've done, and what is ahead yet to do. And so I facilitated that conversation with the board, but then they took it and ran with it. And so they had the tools, but then they executed on them, which I thought was awesome. I mentioned speeches, stories, ceremonies, and symbols, and I've got a list of all that they did there. But let me just offer a few thoughts that were good. I think the speech that Reverend Kin did, his sermon on the first day that they were in the new space, that sermon of the centennial where they had been, and now let's enjoy the plateau, but we've got work yet to do. Got to now fill this space with people, and we've got to welcome people in. And there were a handful of other speeches that were really important. The stories that I really loved, some of which I've shared with you, but they chose when they had that first day, they chose to hire a restaurant in the neighborhood to cater their opening hospitality that day. They continued to tell the story of, we're in our 9th home, we're about to move into our 10th home, and reminding people that it's not a bad thing that we're moving to a different space. It is we've outgrown this space. We need to do this move. But people had to be reminded that it wasn't like they gave up a 90-year home, they gave up a 20-year home. Some of the symbols, I've got to tell just briefly that the story of the stained glass windows. The city historical architect wanted them to restore the windows to their original luster, and Reverend Daigle said, it's not our theology. Like, why would I do that? If we were a mosque or a temple, would you force us to restore Jesus on the cross or Jesus at Gethsemane? And he said, well, but what if the German Methodist community comes back and they want to see the windows? And Ken was like, okay, they've been gone 70 years. I think we're good on this one. But what he ultimately agreed to do was not to destroy, but to retain the windows. They are in storage. Should the German Methodists show up and want the windows back, they're available to them. But he wasn't going to keep them in the space when it didn't fit their theology or their vision of light and color that was going to be there. And at one point, when he was really battling with the city historical architect, he said, I'll take this lawsuit. Like, I'm in San Francisco. I'm on good ground that I can replace these windows. And they kept the outside of them, but replaced the inner. So it was an acknowledgement of the past, and I thought that was a great use of symbolism. Another symbolism that they did on the bus trip from the old church to the new church, everybody was given white stones and pencils, and we wrote on the white stone what our vision of the new space was. And as we showed up, we got off the buses, and there were bins there to put your white stones in. That was, here's my hope for the new space. And then there was the opening of the doors. We walked in, and the band was there, and the music team was there, and welcomed us in with music. And then all of those white stones have been retained. And when the sidewalk is redone, they will be ground into the sidewalk. So they held on to those hopes from day one as a part of the symbolism for what would be there. And then one of the ceremonies that I thought was just lovely, October 31st was the last day that they had the old space. They had to move all their stuff out and let go of the building. The church they acquired, it was left a mess for them. They had a lot of cleanup that they had to do of just getting rid of stuff that church community left. But they left their space as clean as possible. And they did on that last night a smudging ceremony and notes that people could put into the foundation or into places in the building that was a chance for them to say farewell and for them to say thank you to what that building had given them for the 20 years and the opportunity that the cell had done. And all of those symbols and ceremonies, stories were a part of bringing the community with them to the place now where I'd have to check and see, but I would say less than half of the congregation was at the old space. Like in the last, 4 years past the centennial, and the 4 years since then, a lot of new people have come to the church that this is the only unity they've ever known. And the online community has gotten so large. Reverend Daigle actually made designated seats on his board, which can only be held by people who don't live in San Francisco and that attend the live stream service, so that they know as live stream congregants, they have board members that are holding them and sustaining them. So they've done a lot right to make this move from the old building to the new building work.
I have a question. Since the board members had never done this before, there had to be who had the vision or could present them with options, and how did they prioritize those options? I'm speaking as a design consultant, so that's where I'm coming from. So someone had to give them that. Who did that?
Yeah. So in the new space, where did they get the advice for what to do and what not to do?
Right.
They did rely on experts, outside experts. I know there were earthquake seismic experts who came back and said, you can do plan A, plan B, or plan C, and explained what all those choices were in terms of retrofitting, which is the next phase that they have to do. And so they brought in outside experts, some that were paid, some that were there to bid on being able to do the work, but knew that to do the work with the community, they had to interact with the community. They just didn't get to talk to the chairman of the board of trustees or to the senior minister. And so they engaged all of their partners as advocates and educators for the community. And then in terms of the space itself, they did rely on, they have a historical architect who advises them. It's not a building that's on the National Registry, but what's within limits, what's not allowed, and what's in that gray zone in between. And I think those, and then I've advised them on, communication strategies once a decision is made, or as you're making a decision, how to involve people in inclusive decision making, so that they, even if what they voted for didn't happen, they felt like their voice was heard. Painting the outside of the building, there were 4 color choices, and they on the outside of the building they had painted like a big black square that was divided into 4, and here were the 4 color choices, and everybody went out and voted. Now, it wasn't a binding vote, but they wanted to be sure that if they were going to paint this yellow building white, that there was enough buy-in for the white color.
Yeah, I've got a positive experience. A number of years ago, I had designed a number of hospital chapels, furnishings, and et cetera. And it's through that experience, I was brought into a Lutheran church who was going through an expansion project and had architectural plans already there. And so I just took once I got on retainer, I did a master plan and took the master plan to a presentation of options, A, B, C. What if we did this? I like this A, I don't like B, but I like parts of C. So I'd bring the A and C together. And we did this in front of the committee on a poster board situation. And over a 2-year period, we had the complete chapel finished.
Nice.
I did have the committee do a wants and needs list. I want this, but I really need this. And what if we did this? A, B, C. And what really clinched it was what we do accomplish now is for a future generation long after we're gone. So it was a very gratifying experience, and the check cleared.
I love that example, Greg, and I love the sense of wants and needs and having people define. And you'll have different people with different perspectives. For some people, it's a want to have a kitchen downstairs, and for people who are involved in hospitality, it's a need to have an industrial kitchen downstairs. For people who want to lease the space out to make more money, that's a need. For other people, it's like, yeah, well, it's nice to have hot food, but we can do cold food. And so being able to have all of that captured. I know we're almost out of time here. Let me just give you a few resources that are available to you, and they put my email in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to send you the slides as well as the executive summary of the Illuminate book. There are 2 other books that I think are really good for you and your profession to know about. If you're ever presenting data to audiences, Storytelling with Data. Here I've got an easier slide for those who are doing screenshots. Storytelling with Data by Cole Knopflick. Great way to learn how to use data effectively to inspire audiences. And then an oldie but a goodie, Made to Stick, Chip and Dan Heath, 2007. But Why Some Messages Live and Some Messages Don't. And I have my own book out there, Communicate with Mastery. Would love to have you explore it and check it out. How to Speak with Conviction and Write for Impact. This story is not in the book. This happened. This is something I would love to write up at some point, but I haven't found the place to do that. And then I wanted to share with you a number of links and tell you a part of the story that Marilyn knew, but not everybody else on the call knew. My relationship to Ken Daigle is he's also my husband. And so I had a front row seat at the journey here. And it was nice that he could bring me in as a resource. And so that's Ken there. He and I also do one-day workshops that we're getting ready to do a series of here in San Francisco, Kansas City, and New York. And so we partner in crime in other ways. But this is a QR code. If you just want to snap that, it'll take you right to my site, and you can give me your email and I'll follow up with you and send you the slides. Or you've got my email address, my LinkedIn. I do a newsletter that's free. It's not it's just tips on how to communicate effectively that I send out every week or so. And so I'm glad to stay in touch with you, glad to be a resource to the work that you do. And I'm also happy this can just be this one conversation we had on a rainy Tuesday morning to inspire you for the work that you do for the communities that you serve. And with that, thank you for letting me be with you today.
Well, thank you so much, JD. It was very informative, and it was great to be with you this morning. And I know you've helped people, think about their own spaces. So once again, thank you all for participating in this. And thank you, JD.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
I appreciate it.